veto it, and it would be instantly passed by the same vote in both bodies and become law without the signature. So the signature suspense has been a Trump spin of the week to try to keep his right-wing extremists in line. Today's developments were inevitable. From the moment President Trump made the disastrous and irresponsible mistake of shutting down the government, the White House tried to create that suspense in the last couple of weeks about whether the president would sign this compromise government funding bill that was voted on today. But that suspense was never real, not for a single moment. There are enough shell-shocked Washington reporters who find the president so unpredictable that they continued to fall for that suspense, which is completely understandable. But it was always clear, has always been clear, that Donald Trump had absolutely no choice and was going to go along with this. Nancy Pelosi had beaten him very, very badly in this showdown from the moment that she and Chuck Schumer taunted the president before Christmas into foolishly saying that he would shut down the government and be very proud to do it.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely.
fair enough.
And I am proud, and I'll tell you what, I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck.
There are two things that Donald Trump cannot bring himself to do as president and always delegates to others. One is firing people, even though he pretended to be good at firing people in his TV show where he pretended to fire people. And the other is surrendering. And so Donald Trump left it to Mitch McConnell to announce the president's surrender today on the Senate floor.
I've just had an opportunity to speak with President Trump, and he, I would say to all my colleagues, has indicated he's prepared to sign the bill.
The president's official surrender apparently will come in writing in the Rose Garden tomorrow at 10 a.m. The White House has released a statement saying the president is going to be having an event in the Rose Garden. That presumably will be the signing of this bill and possibly whatever he's going to do on a national emergency about this. President Trump will sign the government funding bill. And as he stated before, he will also take other executive action, including a national emergency, to ensure that we stop the national, these are the White House words, the national security and humanitarian crisis at the border. The president is once again delivering on his promise to build the wall. These are the White House words. Put them up there. These are not my words. This is the White House telling the ridiculous line that the president is fulfilling his promise to build the wall, protect the border, and secure our great country. Our great country is secure tonight, and the president has broken his promise to build the wall in every way he could possibly break that promise. The president promised Mexico would pay for the wall. Then the president promised that the Trump tariffs would pay for the wall. Then the president promised that a renegotiated NAFTA agreement that Congress has not approved would pay for the wall. Then the president promised that Congress would pay for the wall. And then the president shut down the government to force Congress to pay for the wall. And then the president surrendered. And there will be no wall. If the president does issue a national emergency declaration to build the wall, it won't work. It will not work. And I can tell you that it won't work from my experience when I was the chief of staff of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, which has jurisdiction over all federal government building projects in the United States. A building project like this, starting from zero today, would be a minimum of 2 years away from breaking ground on the first inch of such a building project. And that's if the building project had the unanimous support of Congress and the country. No one working in the federal government now has any idea how to launch a building project like this under an emergency declaration, even if the Congress and the country supported that emergency declaration. The government simply does not know how to do this. But even more importantly, as you will hear in a moment from the highest legal authority we could find on this subject, the president's emergency declaration will be challenged in court. No one knows this subject better than former acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal, who has argued the most important cases on presidential emergency powers in the United States Supreme Court in the 21st century. Neil Katyal will tell us what will happen in court if the president issues an emergency declaration. The budget agreement that has passed the Senate and the House tonight specifically prohibits wall construction on the California-Mexico border, the entire California border, and on several other stretches of the border, most of the border. Cal Perry will join us from the border tonight with a description of the areas where Congress has specifically forbidden any construction of a Trump wall. So there won't be 1 inch of wall built there ever. Congressman Pete Aguilar of California was one of the members of the conference committee of Democrats and Republicans from the House and the Senate who worked out the compromise language of the budget bill and specifically prevented the building of the Trump wall. Congressman Aguilar will join us tonight, and he can tell us how the deal was done inside that conference committee and why the Republicans on that committee surrendered and did not fight for the Trump wall. The Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, issued a joint statement tonight saying declaring a national emergency would be a lawless act, a gross abuse of the power of the presidency, and a desperate attempt to distract from the fact that President Trump broke his core promise to have Mexico pay for his wall. The Congress will defend our constitutional authorities. And joining us now is Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar. Also joining us is Neil Katyal, an NBC News correspondent, Cal Perry. Congressman Aguilar, first of all, to you, how did this deal come together in the conference committee? And we know that President Trump surrendered, and he surrendered pretty much as soon as he ended the Trump shutdown. But how quickly did the Republicans in this conference committee basically surrender on the Trump wall?
Well, the answer is immediately from the $5 billion number. They never advocated for $5 billion in conference committee. So the important thing to know is we went into that room and we knew that we wanted to avoid a government shutdown. We knew that we needed to protect our national security. And we knew that we had to find that common ground. And so that's what we went into this deal looking at. And we traded numbers throughout all these different categories. But it was important that we did our work, that we had the ability to come together. And this is really just a credit to Chairwoman Nita Lowey and Chairwoman Lucille Roybal Allard, who guided us through this process and really represented our values throughout this entire negotiation.
Congressman, in this Washington Post reporting tonight from inside this story by Robert Costa and others that I was talking about with Rachel Maddow, the elements of it that I do not believe is the idea that President Trump was ever not going to go along with this. But there's a lot more in this story, including how you on the House side, you Democrats on the House side, led by Nita Lowey, actually lowered at the last minute, lowered your offer on any kind of fencing funding or structure funding on the border. And that actually surprised even your Senate Democratic counterparts.
Well, I've heard the same story, too. That was a meeting of the 4 legislative leaders. But our guidance was very clear. You know, we did not want to go any higher than what was in the fiscal year 2018 bill, which was $1.3 billion. Republicans did not want to come down off of their number, and we just continued to work at it. And so Chairwoman Lowey went into the room and said, "This is it." And Senator Shelby took the deal. Again, you know, for those watching, this is less in dollar money to barriers than the president was offered in December.
Before the shutdown.
Before the shutdown, this is less than he received after forcing 35 days of a shutdown. So this is the best that we could do, but it is clearly a blow to what the other side was trying to get to.
Neil Katyal, I think you'll be listening to every word the president has to say. What they have on the schedule here is tomorrow, 10 a.m., president delivers remarks on the national security and humanitarian crisis on our southern border. That could be where he declares some kind of national emergency there. Then what happens if he does that?
Well, I mean, Lawrence, you called this ridiculous, and I would go further. I would say it's a constitutional disgrace. And the idea that he would announce this in the hallowed ground of the Rose Garden at the White House, when it is so antithetical to what our Constitution is about is beyond me. So I'm a textualist, and, you know, our founders in Article 1 of the Constitution said, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law." And our founders gave us that. It is clear as day. And the president is getting very bad legal advice when they think that they can reprogram these funds on the grounds that it's a national emergency. Now, there is a statute, the National Emergencies Act. But again, I'm a textualist. It says national emergency in this. And the president not getting what he wants from Congress is not a national emergency, nor is it a national emergency if the president can't keep his promise to the American people to have Mexico pay for the wall. That's a Trump emergency. It's not a national emergency. So this will be challenged in courts immediately, and it'll be pretty easy to throw this thing out.
Neil, I've just been handed some details from NBC News reporting on what the president is expected to say tomorrow, and specific about the money. He is specifically intending to take $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense, from the drug interdiction program in the Department of Defense, and use that for a building project inside of the United States of America, which is not in the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense.
Yeah, that's what dictators and kings do. I mean, and our founders gave us a constitution which puts Congress in the driver's seat for appropriations. So Congress decided after a lot of debate that the money $2.5 billion should be spent on drugs. They didn't say it should go to his silly wall. And, you know, here's the thing about the national emergency. Presidents have lots of latitude in courts. As you know, I've argued a bunch of these cases. But what they don't have is latitude to define an emergency in contravention to Congress. And here, we've had the 2018 election was all about, should we have this wall or not? Trump lost. We then had a 35-day shutdown over, should we have this wall or not? Trump lost. So the idea that there's a national emergency and that a president could declare it against what Congress wants is so dangerous. I mean, a future president can do it about global warming, about guns, about health care. Our Constitution says no. Congress makes these choices, not the president.
Cal Perry, you're at the border tonight, and you can tell us, as can the congressman, but I'd like to hear from you, Cal, based on your reading of the legislation, where does the law actually prohibit any building of wall?
Well, the crushing defeat seems to be compounded by detailed instructions of where the president and the administration cannot spend the money. So normally in these spending bills, we find out where money's going. In this one, we found out where it's not going. There are 5 locations in the Rio Grande Valley where Congress is specifically saying the president cannot build a wall. And keep in mind, as you said at the top, we're already counting out California and Arizona and New Mexico and most of Texas, just the Rio Grande Valley, compounded further by 5 cities being named by Congress as untouchable to the administration, saying no funds made available in this act shall be used for construction while consultations are continuing. So you have individual sites, Lawrence, like the La Lamita Chapel, which we reported on a few weeks ago, and then you have entire cities. The reason for that is look at the gap behind me in this wall. This is what we're up against here. The gap behind me is because of lapses in funding, but also because you have private landowners between that wall and the border, and those private landowners have rights, and those rights have to be respected, and until they are, the gate behind me is not going to go in. The wall behind me took 10 years to complete. It's still not done. In a few months, that gate's going to go in. So it gives you an idea of sort of how ridiculous the entire process has become. When you take it a step further, you have Congress explicitly telling the administration you are not allowed to build walls in certain places, rather than here's some funding for the wall, Lawrence.
Congressman Aguilar, with this information we have that they're going to take $2.5 billion from the Defense Department and somehow try to transfer that into spending for a domestic building project, it's not clear at all what department that money would go to for this building project. Obviously has no authorization from Congress, as a building project in the United States has to have. What is your reaction to taking $2.5 billion from the Defense Department, as the president is going to try to do?
Well, it's wrong and it's unconstitutional, and I'm not going to yield my time back to Neil, but he was citing, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which gives us that responsibility. So we will use every tool possible in order to push back against the administration and hold them accountable. But one of those tools is going to be having individuals from the Pentagon come to the Defense Appropriations Committee, of which I serve on, and to explain exactly what they plan to do and why they feel this transfer is allowable if the president so chooses. I heard the worldwide threats assessments just like you reported 2 weeks ago. And guess what? DNI Dan Coates never mentioned the southern border in 70 pages of testimony to the Senate. So this is not a crisis. There is a crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and our bill went a long way in order to help in that regard. But this is not a crisis. We will push back. We will hold the administration accountable. I know they don't like it. I know they haven't had it, but it's coming.
Neil Katyal, the case that's come to mind for me tonight is, I think it's around 1998, the line item veto case in the United States Supreme Court, where they tried to pass a line item veto for the President of the United States. And it was held by a majority of the court that no, the only thing a president can do with legislation is sign it or veto it. The president has no other choice but to sign it or veto it. The president cannot reach inside the legislation and, in effect, change something inside that legislation, which a line item veto would allow him to do, the way governors are allowed to do. That vote was 6-3. Clarence Thomas voted that the president does not have the right to tamper with legislation that way. I don't see, even on this Supreme Court with 2 Trump appointees, how a Supreme Court could possibly find that the president has a right to do this.
I love coming on your show, Lawrence, because you make exactly the right point. The line item veto case is devastating for these folks, and that's one of many reasons I think this is not a conservative versus liberal issue when this case goes to the Supreme Court. I think this is truly an American foundational issue. Do we want to take away the power from the Congress invested in a president? Now, what they're going to say in response is, well, Congress has passed something, the National Emergencies Act, which allows the president to reprogram funds. And there's no doubt in true emergencies that can happen. But here's where I'm so worried about what the president does. Just apart from all the constitutional, disgrace he's engaged in, these statutes like the Emergencies Act are passed for an important reason. Sometimes in a true emergency, Congress can't get together and act. And so you need to authorize presidential swift action. And when President Trump does this, what he does is erode the foundations of that emergency power. And no future Congress can ever trust the president again. And that's a terrible place to be. And so, what he's doing is not just destructive of our Constitution, but it's destructive of the suite of powers that a president truly should have in a real emergency.
Neil Katyal, you're making important points when a member of Congress says he's willing to cede you some of his time. Congressman Pete Aguilar, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. And Cal Perry, thank you for that report from the border. Really appreciate that. Shortly after Mitch McConnell delivered President Trump's surrender on the Senate floor, Ann Coulter tweeted, "There's no coming back from this. No emergency or presidential powers will allow him to build the wall ever after he signs this bill. Trump has just agreed to fully open borders." Of course, Trump did not agree to fully open borders, but Ann Coulter does seem to remember enough of her constitutional law classes to know that no emergency or presidential power will allow the president to build that wall ever. She is right about that. But is Ann Coulter speaking for any Trump voters not named Ann Coulter? The president was weakened today in more ways than Trump voters and probably anyone in the White House actually understands. Mitch McConnell turned the ship of the United States Senate around and started heading away from Donald Trump for the first time. When Donald Trump shut down the government, Mitch McConnell's position was he would not consider even bringing up a bill to a vote in the Senate if the president did not already approve of that bill while it was being negotiated.
We're not interested in having show votes here in the Senate. We're interested in bringing up something the House has passed, 60 senators will support, and the president will sign.
And that is all over. The constitutional truth of the matter is that the president only has as much legislative power as Congress decides to let the president have. This week, Mitch McConnell decided to take his power back from President Trump. Mitch McConnell agreed to a bipartisan legislative package without President Trump's approval, and then Mitch McConnell scheduled that bill for a vote on the Senate floor without President Trump saying that he supported that bill. And only when even President Trump's people could see that the bill Mitch McConnell was bringing to the Senate floor was going to get over 80 votes, only then did Donald Trump let Mitch McConnell announce that Donald Trump supports it. It's a whole new ballgame in the United States Senate because of that procedure. Mitch McConnell decided he no longer needs Donald Trump's support to bring a bill to a vote, and that alone is a devastating blow to Trumpism in the United States Senate. On days like this, we need experienced political observers who can see the big picture in all of the individual maneuvers of the day, and we have that in our next guests. Joining us now is John Heilman, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He is co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. Also with us, Rick Wilson. He's a Republican strategist and contributor to the Daily Beast. He's the author of the book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. John Heilman, this is the end of the line for Donald Trump's wall, and tomorrow in the Rose Garden, he tries to turn the corner, apparently on the emergency idea.
Yes, he will. He often claims victory when he loses. He often changes the subject when he loses. He will try to do both tomorrow. But I do think it's super important what you just said, Lawrence, in the long arc of this presidency. You think about the past two years and 2 months. We have not seen, I believe, any instance, except for possibly the original passage of Russia sanctions that the Congress did over Donald Trump's objection. Until now, we've not seen the Congress assert itself, certainly not the Republicans in the Congress assert themselves and say, I'm sorry, we're done. The political consequences of sticking with you are too high, and so we were going to go about our business until exactly now. And I think that is a watershed moment in this presidency, because to me, it is the most important math calculation of all math calculations that every United States senator has to do. Does it cost more to stick with Trump, or does it cost more, or does it cost more to abandon Trump? And for 2 years and 2 months, the answer has been it would cost us more to abandon him. At this moment, on this issue, and potentially now on many more issues going forward, and some of great consequence and moment, including the existence of the Trump presidency, this will be the moment where Republican senators have figured out that there's a different math game in town, and that could be incredibly, incredibly bad news for President Trump.
Yeah, and Rick Wilson, we have the Washington Post report from the inside of this story leading up to where we are now, and they have the Republicans in the conference committee surrendering instantly on the Trump wall, not even attempting to get any kind of funding for that. That was just confirmed. That reporting in the Washington Post tonight was just confirmed by us, by one of the conferees, Congressman Pete Aguilar, that when the wall came up, the Republicans in the House and the Senate in that conference committee didn't even fight for it, didn't even make a request.
Right. Lawrence, as John said, they have reached an inflection point in the Senate particularly where they know they have a very big field coming up in 2020 in the Senate side. It's the bad year for Republicans in 2020 in the Senate, and they recognize the damage they were taking from the shutdown and the damage that they'll take from this emergency and the constant drama over the wall, which does not appeal to the majority of American voters, even to a meaningful fraction of American voters, is causing them this enormous political radiation that they're absorbing. And at some point in politics, everyone cuts bait and everyone says, well, I want to save my seat. I want to save my own position here. And this guy is dragging us down. He's a boat anchor around our necks. And so they've decided tonight, at least, that they're going to show some spine. And I think that the reason that the president, who is desperate for any kind of fraction of an ability to claim a win on this, will go out tomorrow and basically in front of the cameras lie for half an hour and say, my beautiful, glorious wall is already 90% completed and this is a great victory and I can take this money from wherever I want. It's, of course, a fantasy, But, he is certainly a guy who is prone to fabulism. And so I think we're going to expect tomorrow a fairly pathetic whimper to end this entire wall drama.
So, John, Mitch McConnell said before the shutdown, he said emphatically, there will not be a shutdown. Right. And he said that because as Senate Majority Leader, he knew he had the power to prevent it.
All along.
But then when Donald Trump did the shutdown, Mitch McConnell went along with it.
Yes, he did.
Throughout the shutdown, senators were standing up there saying, you can bring a bill and we will pass it right now. It increasingly toward the end, McConnell was privately telling the White House, there's 70 votes in the Senate at least right now, a veto override margin for anything that I would bring to reopen the government. Then Mitch McConnell says, you shouldn't use emergency power. He says it publicly. I don't want any emergency power used here. Now Mitch McConnell goes out on the Senate floor today and says he supports the president's use of the emergency power because that, for him, I believe, is the end game. The president will try to use the emergency power. He will be immediately stopped with an injunction in court, and then Mitch McConnell doesn't have to pay any attention.
Correct. It is for McConnell again a cost-free fig leaf for the president. If that's what it takes to make this all go away, Mitch McConnell can live with that. And I think that's exactly right. There's no question. There will be no national emergency. The courts will stop the president. And most Republicans, privately and in some cases publicly, think the national emergency is a bad idea. I do want to say, though, I think it's super important, and Rick said something that I am inclined to say at various times. They found their spine. They didn't find their spine. What they found was they're now using a different algorithm to calculate their self-interest. That's all it's ever about with these people is their self-interest. And so to me, the reason this is significant is not about the shutdown. It's not about the wall. It's an answer to the question of people who have been asking us for 2 years. There's no way Trump will ever be impeached and convicted in the U.S. Senate because they have no guts, they have no spine. And I keep saying, it doesn't have anything to do with guts and spine. It has to do with when does the moment come when Republicans do a different math. And the math says we are free to leave Trump because if we stick with him, it costs us more. This is the first thing, an issue of policy, government funding, and immigration, where they have realized there's a different calculus. And I think that the important thing here is that this kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that leads them to challenge Trump on a variety of other things, again, not because of spine, but self-interest, and potentially to challenge him on the question of his entire presidency, because it's not going to be about spine or principle or caring about America. It's about them being able to keep their jobs.
We have already run through one commercial break on this breaking news. We're going to have to get to one now. John Heilemann, Rick Wilson, thank you both for joining us. And when we come back, former acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe has a new book out coming up next week. He will join us on this program next week, but he has already spoken to 60 Minutes about many things, including the serious discussions that he participated in at the Justice Department about removing President Trump from office using the legal process of the 25th Amendment, which has never been used before. And later, in tonight's Last Word, the presidential campaign came to the floor of the United States Senate today. We'll take a look at how the Democratic presidential candidates voted on the budget bill today and how they will have to explain that vote on the campaign trail. They didn't all vote the same way. The Washington Post's Greg Miller has read former Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe's new book and noted this about Andrew McCabe's experience working with Attorney General Jeff Sessions of Alabama. The FBI was better off when you all only hired Irishmen, Sessions said in one diatribe about the Bureau's workforce. They were drunks, but they could be trusted, not like all those new people with nose rings and tattoos. Who knows what they're doing? I guess I'll have to ask Andrew McCabe about all those drunk, trustable Irishmen. But on Tuesday of next week, when he joins us in his first MSNBC discussion of his new book entitled The Threat, How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. In an excerpt published in The Atlantic, Andrew McCabe says he viewed the president as someone who could not be trusted and whose inner circle operated at times like it was serving a Russian mafia boss. Quote, I wrote memos about my interactions with President Trump for the same reason that former FBI Director James Comey did, to have a contemporaneous record of conversations with a person who cannot be trusted. Andrew McCabe has already recorded his first television interview, which will be on 60 Minutes this weekend, Andrew McCabe explained why he opened an obstruction of justice investigation of the president after the president fired FBI Director James Comey and made Andrew McCabe the acting director of the FBI.
I was speaking to the man who had just run for the presidency and won the election for the presidency, and who might have done so with the aid of the government of Russia, our most formidable adversary on the world stage. And that was something that troubled me greatly.
How long was it after that you decided to start the obstruction of justice and counterintelligence investigations involving the president?
I think the next day I met with the team investigating the Russia cases, and I asked the team to go back and conduct an assessment to determine where are we with these efforts and what steps do we need to take going forward. I was very concerned that I was able to put the Russia case on absolutely solid ground in an indelible fashion, that were I removed quickly or reassigned or fired, that the case could not be closed or vanish in the night without a trace. I wanted to make sure that our case was on solid ground, and if somebody came in behind me and closed it and tried to walk away from it, they would not be able to do that without creating a record of why they'd made that decision.
You wanted a documentary record.
That's right.
That those investigations had begun because you feared that they would be made to go away.
That's exactly right.
This morning, Scott Pelley said that Andrew McCabe described meetings at the Justice Department where officials seriously discussed the legal process of removing the president using the 25th Amendment about 4 months into the Trump presidency.
There were meetings at the Justice Department in which it was discussed whether the vice president and a majority of the cabinet could be brought together to remove the president of the United States under the 25th Amendment. These were the 8 days from Comey's firing to the point that Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel. And the highest levels of American law enforcement were trying to figure out what to do with the president.
After this break, we'll have more on Andrew McCabe's revelations from inside the Justice Department and what it means to that Justice Department starting tomorrow, the first full workday for the newly confirmed and sworn-in Attorney General, William Barr. For the first time in history, the Vice President of the United States decided to say publicly today that he has not been part of an attempt to seize the president's job.
I never heard of any discussion of the 25th Amendment, and frankly, I find any suggestion of it to be absurd. I have never heard any discussion of the 25th Amendment by members of this government, and I would never expect to.
We are joined now by David Leonhardt, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and Mimi Roker, a former federal prosecutor and a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. She's also an MSNBC legal contributor. Mimi, so much to talk about here, but imagine, if you will. Well, wait, you don't have to imagine it. Andrew McCabe says it happened. Discussions in the Justice Department, lawyers studying the 25th Amendment, which I started to study a month into the Trump presidency and talked about it here, the removal process by the vice president and the majority of the cabinet of the president to replace him with the vice president.
You know, and look, so many people probably hadn't heard of the 25th Amendment before Trump became president. But I think in many ways it's not about what we're talking about, and even what McCabe is talking about, though it makes for a good story to talk about those conversations. What we're really talking about is the threat that McCabe and others perceived at the time, the threat that they perceived in Trump. And I do not understand how someone now, knowing what we know now, which some of which maybe, McCabe knew, we don't know exactly what he knew at the time, but how anyone now could look at that and say that that was wrong or an irrational belief on McCabe's part. So we can parse the things that he says. The Justice Department put out this statement today. It was really a non-denial denial. I mean, it parsed words very carefully. They're going to, call into question his credibility because he has apparently made mistakes in certain areas. Doesn't mean that he's not a truth teller. But it is clear that at the time he was right in what he perceived about Trump.
David Leonhardt, just one excerpt from the book the Washington Post found. During an Oval Office briefing in July 2017, Trump refused to believe U.S. intelligence reports that North Korea had test-fired an intercontinental ballistic missile. He thought that North Korea did not have the capability to launch such missiles. He said he knew this because Vladimir Putin had told him so.
I mean, do you laugh or cry, right? I mean, Donald Trump, through his whole life, through his rise to fame in New York as a real estate developer, has essentially not cared what the truth is. He's wanted to invent whatever reality is most convenient for him, and that's what we see him doing there. I have to say about the 25th Amendment, Lawrence, I actually in some ways take some cheer from it because it's a sign of how our government should work. People in the Justice Department understanding that their loyalty is to this country and to the Constitution rather than to the president under whom they're serving.
Yeah, they started talking about the 25th Amendment 2 months after I did, and I thought we had serious reason to start talking about it very quickly into this presidency. We're going to have to do a break here. Mimi Rocha, David Leonhardt, thank you both very much for joining us. And when we come back, the 2020 presidential campaign came to the floor of the United States Senate today. That's in tonight's Last Word. The Democratic National Committee announced this afternoon that we are now 4 months away from the first Democratic presidential primary debate, which will occur on this network in June. It will be a primetime debate carried across 3 NBC networks in 2 languages. You can see it here on MSNBC, also on NBC and Telemundo. And we don't know what the most urgent issues and questions will be in June. But if the debate were held next week, one of the big questions would be about the votes cast in the Senate today. Some of the Democratic senators who are running for president voted for the budget agreement, and some voted against it. Today's vote shows us how those candidates are positioning themselves in the campaign and for the debate that's coming up in June. We will take a look at how the candidates voted after this break. Here are 2 Democratic presidential candidates voting opposite ways on the budget bill today.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Lankford. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye.
They were the last 2 presidential candidates to vote today. The others, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, had already voted no on the bill. Amy Klobuchar is the only announced candidate who voted yes. Senator Sherrod Brown, who is considering a possible presidential campaign, also voted yes for the bill. At first glance, this looks like a simple liberal versus less liberal divide, with the liberal senators voting no and the less liberal senators voting for the compromise budget bill. But then came this vote. That was Senator Bernie Sanders in the middle of the screen there, voting for the bill. He did not vote with the most liberal Democratic senators who were running for president. Might that mean that Bernie Sanders is not going to run for president? We asked each of the candidates why they voted the way they did. We got a reply from Senator Harris's office. Senator Kamala Harris's staff told us that she could not support increased funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which she sees as dysfunctional and in need of better leadership and stronger oversight. Senator Harris was especially concerned about increasing the size of detention facilities that are holding families, children, and others who have committed no crimes. You can imagine on a debate stage that Senator Klobuchar and possibly Senator Sherrod Brown would say that they share Senator Harris's concerns, but decided in the end to support the compromise because it was the best agreement that could be obtained by continue to fund the government. But that doesn't sound like a Bernie Sanders answer, does it? I mean, as a presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders' pitch was not exactly, I will fight for the best compromise we can possibly reach with Republicans in Congress. Senator Sanders' office gave us this statement. While I have concerns about aspects of this bill, I will vote for it because I cannot turn my back on the 2 million federal employees and private contract workers who would be forced again to work without pay. For these federal employees and their families, going without pay again would be an act of extreme cruelty, which I cannot support. I am also concerned about the millions of people who would be denied access to government services. That still sounds like a solid answer for Bernie Sanders if he is on the presidential debate stage. Senator Harris, Senator Warren, Senator Gillibrand all cast a no vote that is consistent with their political brand. Cory Booker, whose brand is a bit mixed between liberal and compromiser who can work with both sides, cast a vote to shore up the liberal side of his brand. Amy Klobuchar, whose brand is, I know how to work with both sides and get something done, cast the vote today that shows her ability to compromise to get something done. All of the Senate Democrats who voted against the bill are running for president, except one. The junior senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey, voted no. In this case, he was voting the way his senior senator did, Elizabeth Warren. How would Ed Markey have voted if Elizabeth Warren weren't running for president? Senator Markey, voting in agreement with Senator Warren, made things much smoother for Senator Warren back in Massachusetts, where her Democratic partner in the Senate won't have to explain why he voted the opposite way that Senator Warren voted. Senator Markey's staff told us tonight that he voted against the bill because U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement